Nothing like this had ever happened in American TV history. While the famous judge was laughing in his own courtroom, the woman across from him was quietly preparing the documents that would silence him forever. These documents wouldn't just expose one case, they would reveal a scandal that shook the entire court system. Judge Greg Mathis had built an empire on being unshakable. For 25 years, his Detroit courtroom had been his kingdom, where his word was law and his judgment was final. At 64, he had seen every type of case, dealt with every kind of person, and developed an almost supernatural ability to cut through lies and expose the truth. His famous laugh had become a weapon, warm when he approved, chilling when he didn't. But on this particular Tuesday morning, Judge Mathis had no idea that his reputation, his legacy, and his very understanding of justice was about to be dismantled by a woman who had spent 3 weeks preparing for this moment. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett walked into the Detroit television studio carrying herself like someone who belonged there. At 43, she had already made a name for herself as one of the most formidable legal minds in Congress. But today she wasn't here as a politician. Today, she was here as an attorney representing people who had been failed by the very system that Judge Mathis claimed to champion. The case seemed routine enough, a civil dispute over a community development project in Dallas that had gone horribly wrong. The Elmwood Community Housing Initiative was supposed to bring affordable housing to a low-income neighborhood that had been neglected for decades. Federal grants totaling $12 million had been awarded to Pinnacle Development Corporation, with the explicit promise that they would build homes that working families could actually afford. Instead, Pinnacle had built luxury condominiums with price tags that made even middle-class families gasp. The same residents who had been promised affordable housing found themselves watching million-dollar condos rise where their affordable homes were supposed to be built. Elderly residents on fixed incomes, single mothers working multiple jobs, and veterans struggling to make ends meet had been completely priced out of their own neighborhood. But what made this case special wasn't just the broken promises. It was what Jasmine had discovered during her investigation. The documents in her black leather briefcase told a story that went far beyond a simple contract dispute. They revealed a systematic fraud that involved not just Pinnacle Development, but a network of officials, lawyers, and yes, television personalities who had helped cover up the theft of federal funds intended for the poorest Americans. Judge Mathis began the hearing with his characteristic confidence. The familiar theme music played, the studio audience settled into their seats, and America's favorite television judge walked out with the smile that had made him a household name. "Good morning, everybody," Judge Mathis announced, his voice carrying that familiar mix of authority and warmth. "Today we've got a case that involves community development, broken promises, and—" He paused, looking at his notes. "A congresswoman who thinks she can come into my courtroom and school me about justice." The audience chuckled appreciatively. They had come expecting entertainment, and Judge Mathis rarely disappointed them. His reputation for putting arrogant politicians in their place was well established, and many viewers tuned in specifically to watch him deflate egos and expose hypocrisy. "We've got Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett here, representing the residents of the Elmwood community in Dallas," Judge Mathis continued, gesturing toward the plaintiff's table. "Now, I've been doing this for 25 years, and I've seen plenty of politicians come through these doors thinking they can turn my courtroom into their personal campaign platform." He looked directly at Jasmine, his expression shifting from friendly to skeptical. "I hope you understand, Congresswoman, that this is a courtroom, not a congressional hearing. We deal in facts here, not political talking points. Are you prepared to present actual evidence, or are you here to give us another one of those speeches we see on C-SPAN?" It was classic Judge Mathis, a direct challenge designed to put his guest on the defensive and establish his dominance from the beginning. The technique had worked on countless politicians, celebrities, and legal experts who had underestimated his preparation and courtroom skills. But Jasmine Crockett didn't take the bait. "Your Honor," she replied calmly, standing and adjusting the files on her table, "I appreciate your commitment to facts over politics. That's exactly why I'm here today. The residents of Elmwood deserve to have the facts presented clearly and completely, without political spin or legal maneuvering." Her tone was respectful but confident, and she made direct eye contact with Judge Mathis as she spoke. She didn't seem intimidated by his reputation or his attempt to diminish her credibility. "I've brought with me today documentary evidence, recorded communications, and financial records that tell a very clear story about what happened to $12 million in federal funding that was supposed to help poor people in Dallas." Judge Mathis raised an eyebrow. Politicians usually responded to his challenges with either defensive indignation or rambling explanations. Jasmine's calm, fact-based response was unexpected. "Well, let's see what you've got, Congresswoman," he said, settling back in his chair. "But I warn you, I've been reviewing housing disputes since before you were practicing law. If you think you can come in here with some paperwork and convince me that a simple contract dispute is actually some grand conspiracy, you're going to be disappointed." The defendant's table was occupied by 3 lawyers representing Pinnacle Development Corporation. Lead counsel Marcus Patterson was a seasoned attorney who specialized in defending developers against community complaints. He had briefed his clients that this television appearance was a formality, a chance to present their side of the story to a sympathetic judge who understood the realities of construction and development. Patterson and his team had no idea what was about to hit them. As Judge Mathis called the court to order and asked for opening statements, Jasmine stood and walked to the center of the courtroom. She carried herself like someone who had been preparing for this moment for months, not someone who was intimidated by television cameras or celebrity judges. "Your Honor," she began, "the residents of Elmwood were promised affordable housing. They were told that federal grants would bring them homes they could actually afford in the neighborhood where they had lived for generations. Instead, they got luxury condominiums that cost more than most of them make in 5 years." She paused, letting that fact settle with the audience and the judge. But this case isn't really about broken promises. It's about stolen money. $12 million in federal funds that were earmarked specifically for low-income housing were diverted to build luxury properties that serve only the wealthy. Judge Mathis interrupted, his voice carrying a note of skepticism. "Congresswoman, every development project has cost overruns. Every contractor faces unexpected expenses. Are you telling me that this company intentionally defrauded the federal government, or are you upset that poor people can't afford nice things?" It was a loaded question, designed to make Jasmine look either naive about construction realities or callous about economic inequality. Judge Mathis had used similar tactics countless times to expose the weak arguments of unprepared litigants. But Jasmine was ready for exactly this response. "Your Honor, I'm saying that Pinnacle Development Corporation took $12 million that was legally required to be used for affordable housing and spent it on luxury amenities that were specifically prohibited by their federal grant agreement." She walked to her table and picked up a thick binder. "I have copies of the original grant application, the federal approval letter, and the detailed spending requirements that Pinnacle agreed to follow. I also have their actual construction records, showing exactly how they spent the money and what they built." Judge Mathis leaned forward, his interest genuinely piqued despite himself. "And how exactly did you get access to federal grant records and private construction documents, Congresswoman?" Jasmine smiled slightly. "I'm a member of Congress, Your Honor. I have oversight authority over federal spending. When my constituents told me their community development funds had been stolen, I used my congressional authority to investigate. What I found was far worse than anyone imagined." The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted perceptibly as Jasmine opened her binder and pulled out the first set of documents. Judge Mathis had expected political grandstanding or emotional appeals. Instead, he was looking at congressional letterhead, federal agency seals, and the kind of official documentation that couldn't be dismissed as partisan rhetoric. "These are the original grant applications submitted by Pinnacle Development to the Department of Housing and Urban Development," Jasmine announced, holding up a stack of papers for the camera to see clearly. "Page 12 specifically states that all federal funds will be used to construct housing units with maximum sale prices of $150,000. She walked closer to Judge Mathis's bench, extending the documents for his review. "The actual condominiums built by Pinnacle have minimum sale prices of $750,000, Not maximum, minimum. The penthouse units are selling for over $1.2 million. Judge Matisse took the documents and began reading, his expression shifting from skeptical to surprised. As someone who had grown up in Detroit public housing, he understood exactly what a difference between $150,000 and $750,000 meant for working families. "Mr. Patterson," he said, turning to the defense table, "is this accurate? Did your clients agree to build homes for $150,000 and instead build condos for $750,000? Marcus Patterson stood, clearly unprepared for this line of questioning. His briefing materials had focused on contract interpretation and construction complexities, not federal grant compliance. "Your Honor, the housing market changed significantly during construction. My clients had to adapt to economic realities. The homes they built are beautiful, high-quality residences that will improve the entire neighborhood." Judge Mathis's famous laugh filled the courtroom, but this time it wasn't warm or friendly. Beautiful homes that the people who were supposed to live in them can't afford? That's like promising to feed hungry children and serving them pictures of food. The courtroom audience murmured their agreement, but Jasmine wasn't finished. She returned to her table and picked up another folder, this one marked with yellow sticky notes. "Your Honor, the price difference is actually the least problematic aspect of this case," she said, her voice taking on a harder edge. "The real issue is how Pinnacle used federal funds that were legally required to benefit low-income residents." She pulled out a series of bank statements and financial records. "These are Pinnacle's construction expenditure records obtained through congressional subpoena. They show that federal grant money was used to purchase Italian marble countertops, German luxury appliances, and custom lighting systems that cost more per fixture than most Elmwood residents make in a month." Judge Mathis was now reading intently, his theatrical persona giving way to genuine judicial analysis. The numbers were stark and undeniable. "Furthermore," Jasmine continued, "these records show that Pinnacle's executives received bonuses totaling $2.3 million during construction, bonuses that were paid directly from the federal grant account." The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Even Judge Mathis looked up sharply from the documents. "They paid themselves bonuses with federal money that was supposed to help poor people." "That's exactly what they did, Your Honor, but it gets worse." Jasmine walked to a laptop computer that her assistant had set up near the evidence table. She connected it to the courtroom's large display screen, and financial spreadsheets appeared for everyone to see. "These are internal Pinnacle communications that detail how they plan to circumvent federal oversight requirements," she announced, using a laser pointer to highlight specific entries. The first email that appeared on screen was dated 6 months before construction began. It was from Pinnacle CEO Richard Kessler to his development team, and its content made the entire courtroom fall silent. Quote, "The feds require affordable housing, but they don't define what affordable means to our target demographic. High-income professionals can afford $750,000 condos just fine. Technically, we're still serving the community." End quote. Judge Mathis stared at the screen, his expression shifting from surprise to genuine anger. "Mr. Patterson, did your client really argue that millionaires are the target demographic for low-income housing assistance?" Patterson was frantically consulting with his clients, clearly blindsided by evidence he had never seen before. "Your Honor, that email is taken out of context. Mr. Kessler was exploring all possible interpretations of the grant requirements." "The context," Jasmine interrupted, clicking to the next email, "becomes very clear when you read the rest of the chain." The second email appeared, this one from Pinnacle's financial officer to CEO Kessler. Quote, "Talk to our contact at HUD. As long as we hit the technical requirements on paper, they won't do detailed audits until after completion. By then, the money will be spent and the units will be built. What are they going to do, tear down luxury condos?" End quote. The courtroom was completely silent except for the sound of Judge Mathis's pen scratching across his legal pad. He was taking detailed notes now, his entire demeanor transformed from entertainer to investigating magistrate. But Jasmine saved the most damaging evidence for last. "Your Honor, These emails also reveal something else that I believe you'll find particularly troubling. She clicked to a new screen, revealing an email chain between Pinnacle executives and what appeared to be a legal consulting firm. This communication shows that Pinnacle hired a media consulting company to identify television judges and legal commentators who would be sympathetic to their position if the case ever became public. Judge Matisse looked up sharply from his notes. What kind of media consulting? Jasmine highlighted a specific section of the email with her laser pointer. Quote, Judge Matisse has handled several developer disputes favorably. His background makes him sympathetic to business development arguments. Recommend routing any media coverage through his show if possible. End quote. The implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Judge Mathis had been specifically targeted by Pinnacle's public relations strategy. The company had researched his previous decisions and identified him as someone who could be counted on to side with developers against community complaints. The audience began murmuring again, but Judge Mathis silenced them with a sharp look. His famous confidence was beginning to crack as he realized that his own reputation and judgment were now part of the case he was supposed to be deciding. Congresswoman, he said slowly, his voice lacking its earlier warmth, are you suggesting that this case was brought to my show because the defendants believed I would rule in their favor regardless of the evidence? Jasmine met his gaze directly, her expression serious but not hostile. I'm suggesting, Your Honor, that Pinnacle Development Corporation has engaged in a systematic campaign to avoid accountability for stealing federal funds. That campaign included identifying media figures who might help them avoid consequences for their actions. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle throughout the courtroom. But I'm also here because I believe you're the kind of judge who cares more about justice than public relations. The people of Elmwood deserve to have their story heard by someone who understands what it means when powerful people steal from the powerless. It was a masterful rhetorical move. Jasmine had exposed Judge Mathis's potential bias while simultaneously challenging him to rise above it. She had given him a choice between being the judge Pinnacle had researched and counted on, or being the judge his reputation claimed he was. The courtroom held its breath, waiting to see which Judge Mathis would emerge. Judge Mathis sat back in his chair, processing what he had just heard. For 25 years, he had prided himself on his independence, his street credibility, and his ability to see through manipulation and lies. Now he was being told that a corporation had researched his background and specifically chosen his courtroom because they believed they could predict his decision. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds, an eternity in television time, before Judge Matisse spoke again. Congresswoman Crockett, he said, his voice quieter than usual, you've presented some very serious allegations here, but I need to ask you something directly. He leaned forward, fixing her with a stare that had intimidated countless litigants over the years. Are you suggesting that I'm corrupt? That I can be bought or influenced by corporate public relations campaigns? It was the moment everyone in the courtroom had been waiting for. Judge Mattis was challenging Jasmine directly, putting her in a position where she would have to either back down or accuse a beloved television figure of corruption on national television. But Jasmine had been preparing for exactly this moment. No, Your Honor, she replied calmly. I'm suggesting that Pinnacle Development Corporation believed you could be influenced. I'm suggesting that they researched your background and your previous decisions because they thought they could predict how you would rule. She paused, choosing her words carefully. The question isn't whether they were right about you. The question is whether we're going to let their expectations determine what happens to the people they stole from. It was a perfect deflection that turned the challenge back on Judge Mathis himself. Instead of defending herself against accusations of calling him corrupt, she was asking him to prove that the corporations were wrong about him. Judge Matisse studied her for a long moment, then turned his attention to the defense table. Mr. Patterson, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Did your clients research my background and previous decisions before bringing this case to my show? Patterson looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. His clients were frantically whispering to each other, clearly panicked by the direction the hearing had taken. Your Honor, it's standard practice to research any forum where... "That's not what I asked," Judge Mathis interrupted, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "I asked if you researched my background specifically because you thought I would rule in your favor regardless of the evidence." The courtroom was completely silent as Patterson struggled to formulate an answer that wouldn't destroy his case or his relationship with his clients. "Your Honor, we believe you're a fair and impartial—" "Stop," Judge Mathis said sharply. "Just stop talking." He turned back to Jasmine, and for the first time since the hearing began, there was something approaching respect in his expression. "Congresswoman, you said you had more evidence. Let's see it." Jasmine nodded and returned to her laptop. The next document that appeared on the large screen was a recorded phone conversation transcript. "This is a recorded call between Pinnacle CEO Richard Kessler and Elmwood resident Mrs. Dorothy Williams, an 82-year-old widow who had lived in the neighborhood for 47 years. The transcript appeared on screen, and Jasmine began reading key sections aloud. Mrs. Williams called Pinnacle to ask when the affordable housing units would be available for purchase. Mr. Kessler's response was, and I quote, "Lady, there's no affordable housing. This is a luxury development now. If you can't afford $1 million condo, you need to find somewhere else to live." The courtroom audience gasped audibly. Judge Mathis's expression darkened as he read along with the transcript. "But Mr. Kessler wasn't finished," Jasmine continued. When Mrs. Williams explained that she had been promised affordable housing and had been saving money for a down payment, Mr. Kessler said, "Your promises aren't my problem. This is business, not charity. Find yourself a nice trailer park." The cruelty of the recorded conversation was devastating. Here was a corporation that had taken federal money specifically earmarked to help people like Mrs. Williams, then mocked her for believing the promises they had made to secure that funding. Judge Mathis was no longer reading casually. He was studying the transcript intently, his jaw clenched with obvious anger. "Is there an actual recording of this conversation?" he asked. "Yes, Your Honor. Mrs. Williams recorded it because she wanted to make sure she understood Mr. Kessler's promises correctly. She had no idea she was documenting evidence of fraud." Jasmine clicked a button on her laptop, and Mrs. Williams's voice filled the courtroom through the sound system. She sounded elderly and confused, asking simple questions about when she might be able to buy one of the affordable homes she had been promised. Then came Kessler's voice, dripping with contempt and impatience. The actual recording was even more damning than the transcript because it captured the tone of dismissive cruelty that written words couldn't convey. When the recording finished, Judge Mathis looked directly at the defense table. "Mr. Patterson, would you like to explain to me how this conversation is consistent with your client's obligation to provide affordable housing?" Patterson stood slowly, clearly realizing that his case was collapsing in real time. "Your Honor, Mr. Kessler was having a bad day. The conversation doesn't reflect—" "A bad day?" Judge Mathis's voice rose for the first time during the hearing. "Your client took federal money that was supposed to help elderly people afford homes, then told an 82-year-old woman to find a trailer park, and you're telling me he was having a bad day?" The judge's famous temper was finally showing, but this time it was directed at corporate cruelty rather than unprepared litigants. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She had saved the most explosive evidence for last. "Your Honor, there's one more thing you need to see." She pulled up a final email on the screen, this one dated just 2 weeks before the television hearing. "This is internal Pinnacle communication, discussing their media strategy for today's appearance." The email was from Pinnacle's public relations firm to CEO Kessler, and its content was devastating. Quote, "Judge Mathis will focus on individual responsibility and business realities. The Congresswoman will come across as an out-of-touch politician trying to use taxpayer money to solve problems that aren't really problems. Our polling shows 73% audience sympathy for business development arguments when presented by Judge Mathis." End quote. Judge Mathis stared at the screen, his expression shifting from anger to something approaching humiliation. The corporation hadn't just researched his background. They had polling data on how his audience would react to his anticipated defense of their position. "They polled your audience," Jasmine said quietly, "to make sure they could predict not just your decision, but how viewers would respond to it." The courtroom was dead silent. Even the defense lawyers had stopped whispering to each other. Judge Mathis closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them and looked directly at Jasmine. "Congresswoman, in 25 years of television, nobody has ever come into my courtroom this prepared." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "More importantly, nobody has ever shown me so clearly how my own reputation could be used against the people I thought I was serving." It was a moment of genuine vulnerability from a man who had built his career on projecting unshakable confidence. Judge Matisse was admitting that he had been outsmarted and manipulated by corporate public relations experts who understood his psychology better than he did. But Jasmine wasn't interested in humiliating him. She had exposed the manipulation not to destroy Judge Mathis, but to free him from it. "Your Honor," she said respectfully, "Pinnacle Development Corporation made one crucial mistake in their research." Judge Matisse looked at her questioningly. "They assumed that once you understood how they had tried to manipulate you, you would still care more about your image than about justice for Mrs. Williams and the other residents of Elmwood." She paused, looking him directly in the eye. "I don't think they researched you nearly as well as they thought they did." The challenge hung in the air between them, not an accusation, but an invitation. Jasmine Crockett had just given Judge Mathis the opportunity to prove that his commitment to justice was stronger than his ego, stronger than his television persona, and stronger than any corporate public relations strategy. Judge Mathis sat quietly for what felt like an eternity, his hands folded on his desk, his expression unreadable. The courtroom audience waited in absolute silence, understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented in television history. Finally, Judge Matisse spoke, his voice lacking any trace of his usual theatrical flair. "Mr. Patterson, please approach the bench." The defense attorney walked forward reluctantly, clearly dreading what was coming next. "Counselor, I've been reviewing these documents while Congresswoman Crockett has been presenting her case. I have some very direct questions for you, and I want very direct answers." Judge Matisse held up the federal grant documentation. "Did your clients take $12 million in federal funding that was specifically earmarked for affordable housing?" "Yes, Your Honor, but did they use that money to build luxury condominiums that cost 5 times more than the affordable housing they promised?" "The market conditions changed, Your Honor. Did they pay themselves $2.3 million in bonuses using federal money that was supposed to help poor people?" Patterson's silence was answer enough. Judge Matisse set down the documents and looked directly at the defense table where Pinnacle's executives were sitting. "Mr. Kessler, stand up." The Pinnacle CEO rose slowly, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Sir, I want you to look at this courtroom. Look at these cameras. Look at this audience." Kessler's eyes darted around the room nervously. "You researched my background. You studied my previous decisions. You hired consultants to figure out exactly how to present your case so that I would rule in your favor." Judge Mathis's voice was growing stronger, more authoritative. "You were so confident that you could manipulate me, manipulate this courtroom, and manipulate the American people watching at home that you didn't even bother to prepare a real defense for stealing federal money." He stood up behind his bench, his full authority now focused on the corporate executives who had tried to game his system. "Well, congratulations, Mr. Kessler. You successfully predicted how Judge Mathis usually handles corporate disputes. What you failed to predict is how Judge Greg Mathis handles thieves who steal from poor people." The courtroom erupted in applause, but Judge Mathis silenced it with a gesture. "I'm not finished." He turned his attention back to Jasmine, his expression now showing genuine respect. "Congresswoman Crockett, you didn't just present evidence today. You gave me an education. You showed me how corporate manipulation works, how public relations campaigns can be designed to predict and influence judicial decisions, and how easily good intentions can be turned into tools for exploitation." Jasmine nodded acknowledgement but remained standing respectfully. "More importantly," Judge Mathis continued, "you showed me what real preparation looks like. You didn't come here with talking points or political rhetoric. You came here with facts, documentation, and a clear understanding of what justice actually requires." He looked back at the defense table. Mr. Patterson, here is my ruling. Your clients committed fraud. They took federal money under false pretenses, used it for unauthorized purposes, and then tried to cover up their theft with public relations manipulation. The judge's voice was now carrying the full weight of his authority. Furthermore, the evidence presented today shows a pattern of cruelty and contempt toward the very people this federal funding was designed to help. The recorded conversation with Mrs. Williams alone demonstrates that your clients never intended to honor their commitments to the Elmwood community. Judge Mathis picked up his gavel, preparing to deliver his final judgment. I am ordering Pinnacle Development Corporation to immediately refund the full $12 million in federal grant money, plus interest, to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Additionally, I am ordering them to pay $5 million in damages to the residents of Elmwood who were defrauded by this scheme. The courtroom erupted again, but this time Judge Mathis allowed the applause to continue for several seconds before calling for order. But there's one more thing, he continued, his voice carrying a personal note that hadn't been there before. Congresswoman Crockett, you taught me something important today. You taught me that real justice isn't about being tough or being smart or being popular. Real justice is about being prepared to face uncomfortable truths, even when those truths challenge your own assumptions. He looked directly into the cameras. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been doing this show for 25 years. I thought I had seen every kind of case and every kind of manipulation. Today, I learned that I was being manipulated in ways I never even considered. Judge Mathis set down his gavel and walked around his bench, approaching Jasmine directly. Congresswoman, the residents of Elmwood are lucky to have you as their advocate. But more than that, the American people are lucky to have someone in Congress who understands that real oversight means doing the hard work of investigation, preparation, and holding powerful people accountable for their actions. He extended his hand to her, and she shook it firmly. Thank you for reminding me what my job is really supposed to be about. The standing ovation that followed was unlike anything that had ever happened on Judge Mathis's show. The audience wasn't just applauding good television, they were applauding the restoration of faith in a system that many had given up on. As the cameras continued rolling, Judge Mathis made an unprecedented announcement. Folks, this show has always been about justice. But today I learned that justice sometimes requires us to look in the mirror and ask whether we're part of the problem or part of the solution. He looked back at Jasmine, who was packing up her documents with quiet satisfaction. Starting next week, this show is going to begin featuring more cases involving corporate accountability and government oversight. If there are other communities out there dealing with the kind of fraud we exposed today, I want to hear from them. Judge Mathis turned back to the cameras for his closing statement. The people of Elmwood trusted their government to help them, and they were betrayed by corporations who saw federal funding as just another profit opportunity. But they were also served by someone who understood that real representation means doing your homework and fighting for people who can't fight for themselves. The episode concluded with contact information for reporting similar cases and resources for communities dealing with development fraud. But the real conclusion came 6 months later when Pinnacle Development Corporation's executives were indicted on federal fraud charges, and when comprehensive housing fraud legislation passed Congress with bipartisan support. The legislation, dubbed the Elmwood Act, required unprecedented transparency in federal housing grants and established criminal penalties for executives who misused community development funds. It was signed into law in a ceremony attended by both Judge Mathis and Congresswoman Crockett, who had become unlikely allies in the fight for housing justice. But perhaps the most important outcome was the message it sent to powerful people everywhere. Preparation and persistence can overcome public relations manipulation, and justice can prevail when people refuse to be intimidated by wealth, influence, or reputation. Mrs. Dorothy Williams, the 82-year-old widow who had been told to find a trailer park, was able to purchase one of the affordable homes eventually built in Elmwood with the recovered federal funds. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, she thanked Congresswoman Crockett for proving that someone in government was actually listening. Judge Mathis attended that ceremony too, and in his brief remarks he said something that captured the entire experience. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to a judge is meeting a lawyer who's better prepared than he is. What the cameras didn't capture was the personal transformation that occurred in Judge Mathis during those 2 hours of televised proceedings. Behind the confident exterior that had made him a household name for 25 years, a profound shift was taking place, one that would fundamentally change how he approached justice, media, and his own role in American society. The revelation that Pinnacle Development Corporation had researched his psychology, predicted his responses, and essentially gamed his courtroom hit him harder than any criticism he had ever received. For a man who prided himself on his independence and street credibility, discovering that corporate consultants had turned his reputation into a marketing tool was devastating. "I went home that night and couldn't sleep," Judge Mathis later revealed in an interview. "I kept thinking about all the cases I'd heard over the years, wondering how many times corporations had chosen my show specifically because they thought they could predict my decisions." The wake-up call came not just from Jasmine's evidence, but from her approach. Unlike the politicians and lawyers who had appeared on his show over the years, she hadn't come to perform or grandstand. She had come to work, the hard, unglamorous work of real investigation and documentation that most people in Washington had forgotten how to do. Watching her present that evidence was like watching a masterclass in preparation, Judge Mathis admitted. She didn't raise her voice, didn't make personal attacks, didn't try to embarrass me. She just laid out the facts so clearly that denial became impossible. The 3 weeks leading up to that confrontation had been unlike anything in Jasmine's congressional career. Working with a small team of researchers and legal experts, she had methodically constructed a case that would be ironclad under any scrutiny. Every document was verified through multiple sources, every recording was authenticated, and every legal argument was researched to ensure it would hold up in real court proceedings. "We knew we'd only get one shot," explained Maria Santos, one of Jasmine's senior staffers who coordinated the investigation. "Judge Mathis has a reputation for cutting through weak arguments in seconds. If we came in unprepared or tried to wing it, he would have destroyed our credibility and the case would have been over." The team had studied not just the Pinnacle fraud, but Judge Mathis himself, his background, his judicial philosophy, and his television persona. They understood that he responded to strength, respected preparation, and valued authenticity above political positioning. "Congresswoman Crockett made a strategic decision early on," Santos continued. "She could either try to embarrass Judge Mathis publicly, or she could challenge him to be the judge he claimed to be. She chose the harder path, but the one that would actually serve her constituents." The aftermath of the hearing created ripple effects that extended far beyond television ratings or political scoring. Within weeks, similar cases began surfacing across the country as other communities realized they might have been victims of comparable fraud schemes. The Department of Housing and Urban Development launched a comprehensive audit of community development grants, ultimately recovering over $200 million in misappropriated funds. Judge Mathis's own transformation became a model for how public figures could acknowledge manipulation and use that awareness to better serve their audiences. He began featuring investigative journalists on his show, established fact-checking protocols for his research team, and created a new segment specifically devoted to corporate accountability cases. "The hardest thing was admitting that I had been played," he reflected months later. "But Congresswoman Crockett taught me that real strength comes from facing uncomfortable truths, not from pretending they don't exist." For Jasmine, the experience reinforced her belief that effective governance requires the same kind of methodical preparation that makes for effective legal representation. The skills that had made her a successful attorney, thorough research, careful documentation, and strategic presentation, proved to be exactly what congressional oversight needed. "Too many politicians treat hearings like opportunities for sound bites," she explained to a group of law students studying the case. "But oversight is supposed to be about uncovering truth and ensuring accountability. That requires actual work, not just clever rhetoric." The Mathis moment, as it became known in political circles, demonstrated that even the most confident, experienced public figures could be caught off guard by someone who had simply done their homework better than anyone expected. The documents Jasmine Crockett presented that day didn't just win one case. They exposed a system of corporate manipulation that had been operating in plain sight for years. Housing fraud, federal grant abuse, and media manipulation continue to affect communities across America. But this confrontation proved that accountability is possible when someone is willing to do the work of real investigation. What other cases are waiting for someone prepared enough to expose them? What other communities are being failed by corporate greed and government negligence? The tools for oversight exist, but they require people willing to use them. Subscribe to see more stories of accountability winning over influence. Hit that notification bell so you never miss the moments when preparation meets power and justice actually prevails. And tell us in the comments, what other examples of corporate manipulation do you think deserve this level of investigation? Because when citizens demand real accountability, politicians and judges have to deliver real results.